Growing up as a Muslim in a predominantly Hindu country, I happened to witness some of the worst acts of human violence in 2002, the Hindu-Muslim communal riots, which ended up with the death of over 2,000 souls.
तलवार से मारा था, मेरे दादा को मारा था, मेरी चाची को मारा था और है ना मेरे दादा को बचाने गए ना तो मेरे पापा की डोंगी कर दी इतनी कटी औरत लोग को नंगा नंगा कर करके काटा था
आपके सामने।
हाँ और मेरी चाची को भी नंगा कर करके काटा था और आदमी लोग को कपड़े उतार कर नहीं काटा है।
When I came to Canada and learned about residential schools and the atrocities committed against Indigenous people, somehow I felt it was speaking to me on so many levels deep inside. So what really connects these two seemingly separate incidents? What is the true faith? The Hindu deity or the Muslim Almighty? The Christian God or the indigenous elders? Above all, where is humanity's conscience?
Coming into the school, I remember it was cold. I remember the cold time of the year and that walking up the steps. And that was the beginning of the life at residential schools. Most people are just shocked that they don't know this history. You weren't meant to know it. You weren't meant to hear about it because it's not a nice history. It's a pretty evil, disturbing history, actually. We were here in 1957 and I was 6 years old, and I left when I was 10 in the 1st of 1961. Nobody was asked for consent prior to putting us there, or any child. Did they ever sit down with our families? Did they ever sit down with our communities and say, here's what our underlying agenda is? We'll make sure we take your language. We'll take your culture. You won't know your child by the time we get done. And pretty much that's what happened. But I would say all Indigenous communities were not aware of the underlying agenda. And that's a form of genocide. It is, absolutely.
I find it unconscionable that this took place during my time when I could have done something about it. I was a police officer for 32 of those years when those schools were still operating. And I didn't know about the atrocities that were taking place. My name is Ron Short. I was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer for 3.5 years. Okay, I was working a day shift at Fort Smith, and the sergeant just come up to me and he said, he says, I want you to go out with this agent from the residential schools and pick up 2 children. No report, nothing in writing. I didn't have to report on it after I got back. So I went to this home, and the mother knew why we were there. They knew they had to send their kids to the school or they'd go to jail. Under the federal legislation at that time, they were ordered by law to send their children to residential schools. If they didn't, they could be charged. The children were crying, the mother was crying. I took the one girl from their mother's arms and turned them over to this agent, put them in his car, and away he went to the airport, and I went back to the detachment. A few minutes in my lifetime, I didn't think much of it at the time. The residential schools, from what I knew, they were just a school where isolated children would be given a formal education. I knew more about it than that. I come to find out different later on. They decided that the schools would be run by the churches, because no one would question the church. You know, no one's going to ask, you know, what's going on here.
Every Sunday he was our minister. He was the same guy that got to preach to you and tell you all about, you know, being good and whatnot, and preach about the moral high ground you should be following when he was the worst pedophile going, you know. And I don't care if anybody doesn't like that word. To me, that's what he was. And one of the things that you weren't supposed to do was you're not supposed to go to sleep. But I did fall asleep in his church. I did, and when I woke up, he was looking right at me, and I thought, oh, I was so panicked. I was so scared because he looked right at me, and I knew I was in trouble. I ended up in some room in the church. I was naked, and he sexually assaulted me in the church. And so I was like, just, that's another thing. And then after that, you know what he's capable of doing, and what do you do when you have nobody to help you? You're a little kid. I don't have parents. I don't have anybody to help me. So you learn how to just kind of emotionally isolate, just block everything. And that's kind of the way I carried that into later life. It's just, emotionally, you become numb. Yeah.
This was during the war, Second World War. Money was tight. There was no money to feed all these kids. And a group of kids from the Mohawk Institute were taken out by men in uniform with rifles, and they were shot and killed and buried in an unknown grave and have never been found. The priest who was in charge of the school at that time apparently made a statement, and I have not seen the statement, so I can't identify it as being true. I believe it. But he said, they've been buried in a safe place where you'll never find them. Now, this is the man who was in charge of the school. So somebody knew something about that. Nothing was ever investigated.
At what point does a mass killing or a forced movement become a genocide? I wonder when it started to feel justified to mercilessly kill souls and scar the generations to come.
But we used to come out here every Sunday. We would walk, and as we round this bend, you'll see the chapel. It's a very, very significant chapel. That's where a lot of the abuse took place, not just for girls, it was boys too. It's going down memories again, in memory lane. Hello. Hello. This was my old stomping grounds as a mushhole kid.
Oh, no way.
Yes.
I take care of it now.
Yeah, I do remember coming up here quite a bit. See? If you look at this, here are the ministers who ran it, and this is the last one that we were under. I was under Canon Zimmerman. He was the minister, but you know, it's really difficult history. You shouldn't have had to have been afraid. And the person that was preaching to you had a lot to account for when it comes to child abuse and what was done to children under his care. So a lot of bad memories, a lot of bad memories.
About 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with deep depression. My doctor could give me pills to hide the symptoms, but he couldn't cure me. He referred me to a psychologist, who in turn referred me to the North Bay Indian Friendship Center. And this is after a very short interview, when she determined that one of the causes of my depression was an incident that had happened 50 years earlier. I buried it in my mind and forgot about it, and it came back to bite me 50 years later, and that's why I'm here today.
I'm going to see if I recognize anyone here, because anybody could carve their name in here. See Les Longboat? He was here when I was here. The longboat guy. Before, I could have cared less. I wouldn't even bother coming back here because it wasn't a happy thing. But I think the more that you can come back and deal with it, the easier it is for me. It relieves a lot of pent-up, anxiety, stress.
Ottawa. They were staff from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. After these people heard my story, they each individually hugged and thanked me for coming forward and telling my story, because it gives their story credibility. I'm from the other side of the fence. That was how I got my healing. The people who were hurt the most by the school system were healing me. That was huge. I don't blame the pedophiles. They were sick people. Mind you, their crimes were horrific, but the politicians knew this and let it happen.
કે આ દુનિયાનો કોઈ મુસલમાન આતંકવાદી દરેક હોતા નથી, પણ આ દુનિયામાં જેટલાય આતંકવાદી છે ને એ બીજા બધા જ મુસલમાન છે, પણ સત્ય છે.
You can't undo the hurt. You cause so much pain. Not only, it didn't stay with us, it trickles down to your families, trickles down to the next generations.
फौजी खाली फिर वो लोग का जला
किन लोग
हिंदू लोग का
क्यों
वो लोग रिसर्च के इसके लिए
वो लोग ने तो गंदा काम किया ना, तो तुम ऐसा गंदा काम क्यों करोगे?
मैं तो मारूंगा ही, वो लोग का
क्यों?
जरूर मारूंगा.
The tale of what happened during those dark days in Canada, India, and so many other countries must be told again and again and again. Not out of a morbid desire for gruesome tales, but out of a concern that the innocent dead should continuously sear the memories of the living. Only then can never again cease to be an empty cry.